This knowledge was not lost in time. It did not disappear because history forgot it. It was deliberately removed from sight, sealed inside caves carved from stone, hidden above a silent sea where no empire listened. Preserved not by chance, but by fear. Fear of what happens when prophecy stops being vague. Fear of what happens when sacred words stop pointing endlessly forward and begin pointing now. Early believers knew these writings. They were not strangers to them. They copied them by hand, line by line, believing the words mattered. They quoted them, not as speculation, but as expectation. They guarded them, not as stories, but as warnings. These texts shaped how the faithful understood time itself. They framed history as something moving toward an appointed moment. They whispered that God's plan was unfolding in stages, measurable, visible, and already in motion. And then, slowly, their voices faded. Not burned, not condemned in loud decrees, simply removed from public reading, set aside from open teaching, allowed to exist, but no longer allowed to explain. Not because they contradicted Scripture, not because they denied God, but because they explained prophecy too clearly. They reduced mystery where ambiguity was safer. They offered structure where metaphor allowed control. They suggested that judgment was not symbolic, but imminent, and that implication was dangerous. Tonight, we open the mystery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, not as ancient fragments, not as academic curiosities, but as testimony. Because when these scrolls were rediscovered, they did not simply add detail to the Bible. They challenged how prophecy had been handled for centuries. They raised questions religious authority was never meant to answer publicly. They exposed expectations early believers were never supposed to keep alive. And they revealed why silence became preferable to clarity. Why did these scrolls terrify religious leaders? What kind of prophetic precision made them unsafe? And why does their message still feel unfinished, as though it was interrupted rather than fulfilled? Because this is not about hidden history. It is not about forgotten texts or buried caves. It is about controlled understanding, about who is allowed to interpret prophecy, and what happens when sacred knowledge stops being distant and starts demanding response. Here is what most explanations delay, but we will not. The Dead Sea Scrolls do not speak of prophecy as something distant, abstract, or endlessly symbolic. They do not treat the future as a haze meant only to inspire reflection. They present it as ordered, measured, already moving. Within these writings, prophecy is not poetry waiting for interpretation. It is structure waiting for fulfillment. Time is not an open-ended mystery. It is divided, marked, advancing toward an appointed conclusion. The authors of the scrolls believed they were living inside that movement, not at the beginning of the story, not far from its end, but somewhere within its decisive stages. They wrote as people who believed the final age had already begun, not someday, not in theory, but now. They saw their own generation as standing at the edge of divine action, where judgment was not a distant warning but an approaching reality, where history was no longer drifting, but narrowing. In their worldview, God was not silent. The signs were already present, woven into events, into conflict, into the corruption of leadership, into the division between those who listened and those who ruled. And they believed only a remnant could see it, not because the truth was hidden, but because perception required humility, discipline, obedience. This is the claim that later generations struggled to hold. Because if prophecy unfolds in stages, if it operates on a timeline, then it is not meant to remain symbolic forever. At some point, metaphor gives way to meaning. At some point, interpretation gives way to accountability. And once you recognize that, the silence that followed begins to make sense. Because a timeline does not ask to be admired. It asks to be faced. The Dead Sea Scrolls present prophecy as something alive, already in motion when they were written, already pressing against the present, already demanding response. Not a distant metaphor for the faithful to ponder, but an active framework shaping how history should be understood. And that single idea, that prophecy was unfolding in real time, was enough to unsettle everything built on delay. But this raises a question that cannot be avoided. Who believed this? Who ordered their lives around this expectation? And why did their certainty alarm those who held authority? Because whatever frightened later leaders was not the language of the scrolls, but the confidence of the people who believed them. Most people leave before prophecy stops feeling poetic, before it presses too close, before it demands more than curiosity. They stay as long as mystery feels safe, as long as revelation remains distant, symbolic, untouchable. But if you are still here, still listening, still willing to follow where clarity leads. Then stay with this journey, because understanding has always been a filter, and not everyone is meant to pass through it. To understand why this was dangerous, we must step out of our world and enter theirs. A world where belief was not private, where faith was not symbolic, where the wrong interpretation could cost you safety, belonging, or life itself. This was a world under occupation. Rome ruled the land with iron certainty, legions in the streets, taxation in every household, and the quiet understanding that resistance would be crushed without mercy. But Rome did not rule the soul. That power belonged elsewhere. Religious authority governed meaning. It decided how scripture was read, how hope was framed, and how obedience was defined. In this world, belief determined survival. Not only survival of the body, but survival of the community. The time was fragile, stretching from the 2nd century before the Common Era into the 1st century after it. A period marked by conquest, exile, return, and disappointment. Promises remembered, deliverance delayed. The people lived between expectation and exhaustion. Scripture was not merely sacred text. It was the language of legitimacy. It justified leadership. It preserved order. It kept fragile unity from collapsing under Roman pressure. And whoever controlled interpretation, controlled loyalty. The temple priesthood held this authority visibly, through ritual, sacrifice, and public worship. Their power was institutional, anchored in stone and tradition. Alongside them, an emerging rabbinic leadership shaped understanding more quietly, through teaching, commentary, and careful boundaries around meaning. They were not rebels. They were preservers. They believed stability was obedience. And into this delicate balance, the Dead Sea Scrolls emerged, not shouted from the temple courts, not proclaimed in public assemblies, but written, copied, and studied apart. They did not deny scripture. They did not attack the law. They did not reject God's covenant. They interpreted it too precisely. They spoke of time as something measured by God, of history as something moving according to a divine schedule, of the present age as something already judged in heaven, even if it still appeared unresolved on earth. They suggested that corruption within leadership was not incidental, but expected. That conflict between truth and authority was not accidental, but foretold. This was not theology meant for debate. It was interpretation that reframed reality. In a world under occupation, hope was carefully managed. Too much urgency could provoke rebellion. Too much certainty could fracture unity. Too much expectation could turn patience into unrest. The scrolls did not call for violence, but they redefined allegiance. They divided humanity not by ethnicity or empire, but by faithfulness to divine instruction as they understood it. They spoke of sons of light and sons of darkness, not as poetic contrast, but as lived categories. That precision was unsettling, because vague prophecy can be postponed. Symbolic language can be reinterpreted, but precise expectation demands alignment. The Dead Sea Scrolls emerged in this world not as theology, but as a challenge. Not a challenge to Rome. Rome already ruled by force, but a challenge to those who govern meaning. They suggested that authority did not belong to institutions alone, but to those who truly understood the times. And that idea, quiet, disciplined, written rather than shouted, was far more destabilizing than rebellion. These writings were not rebellious. They did not seek chaos. They sought faithfulness, but they were precise. And in a world held together by careful ambiguity, precision was the threat. Because once people believe that God's timeline is active, they stop waiting passively. They begin watching. They begin discerning. They begin measuring leadership against expectation. And that is when belief stops being manageable. That is why these writings unsettled their world, and why their rediscovery unsettled ours. At the center of the Dead Sea Scrolls lies a question so quiet, yet so destabilizing, that it could not be spoken openly for long. What if prophecy was already unfolding, and most people missed it? Not because it was hidden, not because it was unclear, but because they were not watching for it in the right way. The writers of these scrolls did not ask whether God would act someday. They believed God already was. They read scripture as a living map of time, not a distant horizon, but a path already beneath their feet. If that question is even allowed to stand, everything begins to shift. Because if prophecy was already unfolding, then divine judgment was not distant or theoretical. It was not reserved for a generation far removed from responsibility. It was approaching the present, testing motives, weighing faithfulness, exposing what had grown comfortable in delay. And if that was true, then religious leadership could no longer hide behind tradition alone. Authority was no longer measured only by lineage, position, or ritual precision. It was measured against alignment with what God was actively doing. That implication carried weight. It suggested that leaders were not merely stewards of memory, but participants in a divine timeline, accountable not someday, but now. In such a world, teaching carried consequences. Interpretation carried responsibility. Silence itself became a decision. This is where the tension begins, not in rebellion, but in awareness. Because once people believe prophecy is unfolding in real time, they stop treating scripture as distant instruction and begin treating it as immediate direction. They begin to ask difficult questions. They begin to notice contradictions between teaching and conduct. They begin to discern whether leadership is guiding people toward truth or merely preserving stability. The Dead Sea Scrolls did not accuse openly. They did not call down judgment in public squares. They simply framed reality in a way that made avoidance impossible. And that framing was enough. Because a question like this does not demand an answer right away. It lingers. It follows. It reshapes how everything else is read. What if prophecy was already unfolding, and most people missed it? The scrolls never shouted this question. They wrote it into their structure, into their timelines, into their expectations. And by doing so, they placed every generation, including ours, under the same quiet examination. But the answer to that question was never written plainly. Not because it was unknown, but because discovery itself was part of the test. So the scrolls leave the question suspended, unresolved, waiting. And in that waiting, the tension deepens. One passage explains why these scrolls could not remain comfortable. It appears in what scholars now call the community rule and the war scroll. Texts copied carefully, preserved deliberately, and never meant to be casual reading. It speaks quietly, but with unsettling certainty. The sons of light shall rise against the sons of darkness. For the appointed time has been revealed to the faithful. Read plainly. It sounds familiar, almost comforting. A moral image of good opposing evil. Light overcoming darkness, as Scripture so often promises. On the surface, it feels symbolic. A timeless metaphor reminding believers to choose righteousness over corruption. A poetic way to describe the inner struggle of faith. But to its original audience, it was not metaphor. It was a schedule. The words appointed time did not mean someday. They meant a moment already marked by God. A fixed point in history toward which everything was moving. The sons of light were not abstract ideals. They were a defined community. Those who believed they had been entrusted with correct understanding. Those who ordered their lives around strict discipline, purity, and obedience. The sons of darkness were not merely sinners in general. They were identified by allegiance to corruption, to compromised leadership, to interpretations that dulled urgency. This was not a general moral lesson. It was a division of reality. The ancient readers understood this passage as describing an approaching confrontation, not necessarily a reckless uprising, but a decisive moment when God would expose who truly stood on his side, a moment when faithfulness would no longer be theoretical. And that is why it caused fear. Because if such a confrontation was approaching, then judgment was not aimed only at the obvious oppressor. It was aimed inward. It implied that existing religious leadership, those entrusted with teaching, guiding, and interpreting Scripture, would be evaluated by the same standard. It suggested that some who believed themselves secure might be found aligned with darkness, not by intention, but by compromise. This passage did not flatter authority. It measured it, and measurement is dangerous when those in power are not prepared for the result. Prophecy, in this moment, stopped being inspirational. It stopped being something recited to comfort the faithful during hardship. It became accusatory. It asked not, "Do you believe?" but, "Are you aligned?" It forced readers to locate themselves within the prophecy, not as observers, but as participants. And once prophecy begins to accuse rather than inspire, it can no longer remain public for long. That is where the tone changes. That is where reverence becomes unease. That is where texts begin to disappear from open teaching, not because they are false, but because they are too exact. This is where many people leave, because clarity is easy until it demands something. When these teachings began to circulate, the reaction was not unified. It never is when prophecy becomes precise. The community fractured, not loudly at first, but subtly, along lines of comfort and consequence. Some leaned closer. They studied these writings quietly, away from public spaces. They copied them by lamplight. They weighed each line with care, not excitement. They were not looking for rebellion. They were looking for alignment. They believed the scrolls explained why the world felt strained, why injustice persisted, why leadership seemed compromised, why history felt as though it were tightening rather than expanding. Others reacted very differently. They denounced the teachings openly, not always by name, but by implication. They warned against dangerous interpretations, against unsettling timelines, against readings of scripture that produced urgency instead of patience. They insisted prophecy was symbolic, that judgment was distant, that order must be preserved at all costs. And then there was a third response, the most effective and the least visible: distance. Not debate, not destruction, distance. The texts were not banned outright. That would have drawn attention. They were simply excluded, no longer copied in official spaces, no longer read aloud, no longer referenced when doctrine was formed. They were allowed to exist, but not to explain. Because you do not argue with prophecy. Argument gives it oxygen. Debate invites examination. Instead, you outlive it. You allow time to soften urgency. You let generations pass without hearing its voice. You replace expectation with tradition. You trade clarity for stability. And slowly, prophecy becomes poetry again. Beautiful, harmless, unthreatening. This distancing did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually, as leadership shifted, as interpretations narrowed, as survival under empire required careful balance. Rome was watching. Unrest was dangerous. Certainty could become combustible. Anything that suggested an imminent divine reckoning, anything that implied current authority might be judged, had to be handled carefully. So the scrolls were not confronted head-on. They were set aside. Their precision became their liability. Their urgency became their silence. And in that silence, something profound occurred. Faith became safer. Expectation became symbolic. And prophecy was allowed to drift once more into abstraction. But the distance never erased the truth the scrolls carried. It only delayed its voice. Because prophecy does not expire when ignored. It waits. And centuries later, when fragments of these writings emerged from caves overlooking the Dead Sea, they did not return as relics. They returned as witnesses. Witnesses to a moment when belief was too informed to be controlled, and certainty was too dangerous to survive openly. That is the forbidden pivot. The scrolls were not suppressed because they were wrong. They were distanced because they were exact. An exact prophecy does not ask permission to speak. It only waits for someone willing to listen. The scrolls were not burned. They were not dragged into public squares and condemned by flame. There are no records of decrees demanding their destruction. They were hidden, carefully, deliberately, sealed in caves carved into the limestone cliffs above the Dead Sea, a place barren enough to discourage pursuit, remote enough to escape empire, and silent enough to preserve what could not survive in daylight. They were wrapped in linen, placed inside clay jars, protected from moisture, insects, and time itself, protected not only from Rome, whose legions crushed unrest without hesitation, but also from reform, from reinterpretation, from being softened into something safer. Those who hid them did not act in panic. They acted with resolve. They believed these writings would be needed again, if not by their generation, then by another. And so the scrolls slept. Empires rose and fell above them. Jerusalem burned. The temple collapsed into ash and memory. Languages shifted. Traditions hardened. And still the caves remained sealed. For nearly 2,000 years, the words waited in darkness, not forgotten, but untouched, until one day, in the mid-20th century, a shepherd searching for a lost goat threw a stone into a cave. The sound that answered was not silence. It was the shatter of clay. That moment, ordinary, unintentional, broke a silence centuries in the making. Fragments emerged slowly, carefully, piece by piece. Scrolls written in Hebrew and Aramaic, older than any known biblical manuscripts at the time. Texts echoing scripture, expanding it, interpreting it, preserved with a precision that stunned scholars. What had been hidden was suddenly undeniable. And with their rediscovery, questions long buried resurfaced. Questions about how scripture was understood before doctrine solidified. Questions about what early believers expected from God. Questions about whether prophecy was once read with more urgency than comfort. The scrolls did not introduce new words. They introduced old expectations. And that was unsettling, because what had been lost was not the text. The words were intact. What had been lost was urgency. The belief that prophecy mattered now. The expectation that God's timeline was active. The sense that faith required readiness, not patience alone. The scrolls returned not as curiosities, but as reminders. Reminders that at one point in history, believers read Scripture as though it was about them. And that realization, quiet, undeniable, reset everything. Because once urgency is recovered, faith can no longer remain passive, and history can no longer pretend. That delay was always the plan. The Dead Sea Scrolls speak in symbols, but never decoration. Their imagery is not ornamental. It is deliberate, precise, urgent. Each symbol carries weight. Each metaphor conceals a warning meant for the discerning few. The first symbol is the most stark, the sons of light versus the sons of darkness. On the surface, it is a simple contrast. Good against evil, faith against corruption. But in their world, this distinction was not abstract. It revealed spiritual allegiance through obedience, through action, not words. The scrolls do not allow neutrality. There is no comfortable middle ground. To exist between light and darkness is, in their terms, to lean unknowingly toward peril. Your faith is measured not by belief alone, but by alignment with purpose, discipline, and discernment. The implication is clear, and it is unsettling. Neutral faith does not exist. Silence is a choice. Inaction is alignment. Every moment of hesitation carries consequence. The second symbol is the teacher of righteousness, a figure mentioned quietly, almost reverently, whose life was marked by persecution. He was not merely a teacher, he was a witness, a prophetic voice silenced by authority, misunderstood by those meant to preserve the law, yet steadfast in obedience to the divine timeline. Through this symbol, the scrolls convey a haunting truth. Truth is often rejected by authority, not because it is wrong, but because it exposes those who are comfortable in compromise. The righteous are measured not by their safety, but by the endurance of their witness under pressure. And the third symbol, the final war, casts the largest shadow. It is not just a battle between men. It is moral and spiritual reckoning. The text frames history as a confrontation that requires participation. Judgment is not something observed from a distance. It is something engaged with, acted upon, lived through. The faithful are not passive spectators. They are participants in the unfolding of destiny. These symbols were never meant to comfort. They were never intended to soothe anxiety or provide simple hope. They were designed to expose, to reveal where faith is genuine and where it is performative, to demand alignment where passivity once reigned, to confront the reader with the cost of inaction. And that is the quiet danger embedded in the scrolls. Because symbols like these are intimate teachers. They speak to the conscience. They measure the heart. They leave no safe distance from accountability. Hearing these truths without staying with them is how understanding dies. It is not enough to glimpse the warning, to admire the symbolism from afar, and then walk away. To truly comprehend the Dead Sea Scrolls, to honor their message, requires commitment, attention, willingness to follow where clarity leads. This is why you must stay. Subscribe, do not stop halfway, because these symbols are alive, and their weight is not measured in parchment, but in the choices they demand. The Dead Sea Scrolls have never been easily contained within a single explanation. Their words invite interpretation, but every interpretation carries consequence. Every reading demands a choice. Some scholars view them as the voice of an apocalyptic sect, a community living in urgent isolation, preparing for confrontation that they believed was imminent. From this perspective, the scrolls explain why the faithful withdrew from the wider society, why rules were so strict, why purity was enforced with such care. They reveal a people attuned to time, alert to every signal of divine action. But this reading also threatens modern understanding. It suggests that prophecy is not merely inspirational or timeless, but pressing, active, and uncomfortably relevant. It forces those of us who study Scripture to ask, are we too complacent? Are we missing signs that should guide us today? Another interpretation situates the scrolls within a messianic timeline. They are seen as mapping expectation, counting stages, anticipating fulfillment, tracing history toward a decisive arrival. From this angle, the scrolls explain why early communities measured generations, why certain events were watched so closely, why alignment with divine instruction mattered so deeply. Yet this interpretation threatens established authority. If prophecy is structured and observable, if the timing of fulfillment can be anticipated, then institutional control over teaching and interpretation becomes fragile. Leadership cannot claim neutrality, cannot defer judgment, cannot hide behind symbolic patience. To understand the timeline is to realize that accountability is immediate, and that certainty cannot be manufactured. A third interpretation reads the scrolls as spiritual allegory. Here, the sons of light and the sons of darkness, the teacher of righteousness, the final war, all are symbols to guide the inner life, reminders to cultivate morality and virtue. They speak in metaphor rather than in active warning. From this view, the scrolls threaten nothing. They can be admired safely, discussed academically, appreciated aesthetically, and that is precisely the problem. Because when prophecy is reduced to allegory alone, its urgency is stripped away. Its power to challenge, to awaken, to provoke response is neutralized. The scrolls lose their edge. Faith becomes comfortable again. Obedience becomes optional, and vigilance fades. None of these interpretations are neutral. Each demands a cost. To see prophecy as urgent, you must confront your own alignment with history and expectation. To see it as messianic, you must measure authority against divine movement. To see it as allegory, you must accept that power has been quieted, and that insight may be lost in the very safety you prefer. And in this tension, in this spectrum of readings, the scrolls continue to speak. Not loudly, not coercively, but insistently. The question is not which interpretation is correct. It is which cost you are willing to bear. Because understanding the Dead Sea Scrolls is not intellectual alone. It is participatory. It is lived. And it begins to ask of you, quietly, how you will respond. This mystery did not vanish with the passing of centuries. It did not dissolve into legend, nor did it quietly settle into forgotten history. It adapted. It moved into the spaces we consider safe. The classrooms where scripture is taught. The pulpits where authority interprets. The books and commentaries that shape understanding. And in that migration, it changed form. Not in essence, but in how it is received. Some questions are encouraged. Those that reinforce tradition, comfort, and continuity. Others are quietly discouraged. Those that press too close to timing, to alignment, to accountability. Some inquiries are tolerated, but the ones that demand vigilance, the ones that measure leaders against prophecy, those are left unanswered. Faith itself has been reframed. Is belief active, alive, and participatory? Or is it inherited, recited, and performed? The scrolls suggest that faith was once active. It demanded attentiveness, discernment, and alignment. It measured the soul against unfolding events. And that measure is uncomfortable. Obedience is no longer only to divine instruction. It has been tempered by tradition, by human authority, by safety. Yet the scrolls insist obedience is not passive. It must be to truth, not merely to what is customary. Inquiry, the sacred act of questioning, discerning, probing, has been managed. Curiosity can be a threat, not because it is wrong, but because it undermines control. Those who are willing to look closely, to follow the signs, to measure leadership and history against expectation, those are the ones the scrolls address directly. And that is their continuing power. Because even today, prophecy waits for attention. It waits for alignment. It waits for those who will treat scripture not as decoration, but as active instruction. The Dead Sea Scrolls did not disappear. They became latent, quiet, almost invisible. But truth does not vanish. It does not age into harmlessness. It persists. It challenges. It waits. Truth does not disappear. People just stop following it. And that is the quiet consequence of distance, of inattention, of comfort replacing urgency. The scrolls remain a mirror, reflecting not only what was hidden, but what is overlooked today. Faith, obedience, inquiry, they are all measured, not by theory, but by lived attention. And the question persists. Will you follow where clarity leads, even when it unsettles everything you thought secure? Why were the Dead Sea Scrolls hidden? Not because they contained heresy, not because they contradicted scripture, but because they removed ambiguity. They did not leave room for comfortable approximation. They spoke with precision. They mapped history with expectation. They measured allegiance and timing. They revealed that prophecy could be understood, not vaguely, not metaphorically, but in terms that demanded recognition, discernment, and response. They suggested that divine timelines were active, that God's purpose was not abstract, but unfolding, observable, immediate. And if that was true, then faith could no longer be passive. Obedience could no longer be inherited or assumed. Questions could no longer be deferred without consequence. Accountability became unavoidable. Leaders, communities, and individuals, all measured against the unfolding revelation. No longer could authority hide behind tradition, nor could delay be mistaken for wisdom. The scrolls placed a mirror before every generation, reflecting clarity where ambiguity had long reigned. This was never about forbidden knowledge. It was never a matter of secret teachings for the curious few. It was about belief becoming too informed to manage, too active to contain, too precise to be ignored. And that is why they were hidden, not destroyed, not silenced by force, but set aside, quarantined in darkness, waiting for a time when the world might be ready to perceive, and yet still unsettled by the weight of understanding. Because when belief becomes informed, it can no longer be guided solely by authority. It becomes a living measure, an active conscience, a force that unsettles institutions and expectations alike. The scrolls were not dangerous in themselves. They were dangerous in the way they illuminated reality, showing that faith was never meant to be comfortable, that prophecy was never meant to be postponed, and that clarity, once received, cannot be unlearned. And in that quiet revelation, we begin to understand why early believers feared them, why silence was chosen over debate, and why time itself could not diminish their message. The scrolls do not shout. They do not demand attention with force. They whisper, but their whisper carries the weight of immediacy. And if we are willing to listen, we feel it, the subtle, uncompromising insistence. That belief, when informed, is never idle. If this is true, if prophecy was never meant to be distant, never meant to be symbolic for convenience, never meant to allow hesitation, then we must reconsider more than just the Dead Sea Scrolls. Other passages, long familiar yet quietly misunderstood, demand a second, careful reading. Daniel, his visions of beasts and kingdoms, once treated as allegory, now pulse with immediacy. Each timeline, each numerical sign, each rise and fall of empires suddenly resonates with the precision the scrolls demanded. It is not merely history repeating itself. It is history unfolding according to a pattern observers were once meant to discern. Isaiah, prophecies of judgment, redemption, and remnant, all written as poetry, yes, but layered with structure. What once comforted or inspired may now confront. Those words were not intended to soothe passivity. They were calls to awareness, to action, to alignment with the divine measure of time. Even Revelation, the visions, the seals, the trumpets, the unfolding of cosmic justice, long cloaked in metaphorical language, now pulse with participatory urgency. The imagery is not distance, it is instruction, a warning not to be witnessed passively, but to be interpreted and acted upon. To remain inattentive is not neutral. It is complicity in delay, in misalignment, in avoidance of what is meant to be observed. And that possibility, the notion that prophecy is structured, active, and requiring response, is more unsettling than the scrolls themselves. Because if the Dead Sea Scrolls were preserved to remind us that divine timelines are observable, then every text, every vision, every warning carries a weight that cannot be ignored. The familiar becomes uncomfortably immediate. The symbolic becomes functional. The distant becomes present. It forces us to ask, how often have we read Scripture as a story from the past, rather than a living instruction for now? How often have we treated prophecy as decoration, rather than as measure? How often have we comforted ourselves with ambiguity, rather than confronting clarity that demands alignment? The scroll's rediscovery is not simply archaeological. It is spiritual, existential, practical. It expands the implication of every text that follows. Every passage once treated as metaphor is a candidate for urgent attention. Every prophecy once considered distant is suddenly alive. And that is the reversal. Expectation is no longer safe. Time is no longer indefinite. Silence is no longer neutral. The Dead Sea Scrolls do not just reveal lost writings. They reveal a method, a way of seeing, a way of measuring, a way of participating in history and prophecy alike. And if we accept that method, we cannot unsee the urgency. We cannot ignore the responsibility. We cannot return to passive faith. The scrolls whisper still. Attention is demanded. Clarity cannot be postponed. And what you thought was long ago is still very much now. Once you see this, Scripture no longer speaks in gentle tones. It stops whispering sweetly from the pages, offering reassurance or poetic distance. It stops allowing you the comfort of abstraction. Prophecy begins to watch. It watches the choices you make, the paths you follow, the questions you leave unasked. It measures your attentiveness, your alignment, your courage to see clearly. And it does so quietly, insistently, without judgment, yet with consequence. The words you once read as history now pulse as presence. The visions once confined to the distant horizon now hover over your present, reminding you that divine expectation is never far from awareness. You begin to notice patterns you had ignored, timelines you had assumed were metaphor, and signs you had passed by as incidental. There is no comfort here. There is no retreat into the safety of interpretation. Every allegory, every symbol, every hidden warning begins to resonate with immediacy. The silence of centuries has lifted, and in its place stands a presence both quiet and uncompromising. You realize, finally, that prophecy is not passive. It does not wait politely. It observes, and in observation, it calls forth response. It asks the faithful to awaken, to discern, to align, or risk the weight of inattention. And then, after this revelation, there is only silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of confrontation, the hush that comes when understanding has arrived, and the world has no answer prepared. No comfort, no summary, only the quiet insistence of clarity, waiting for those willing to remain awake. This mystery does not stand alone. It exists within a tapestry of texts, a quiet chorus of voices reaching across centuries. Among them, there is another, scarcely read, barely understood, a text whose presence is subtle, almost hidden, yet unmistakably resonant. Where the Dead Sea Scrolls whisper urgency, this companion text amplifies it. Where one maps the timeline of prophecy, the other illuminates its purpose, its consequence, its unfolding pattern. Together, they do not simply tell a story, they demand attention. They insist that those who would follow must measure history, faith, and action with renewed discernment. Few have seen them aligned. Fewer still have allowed their combined message to penetrate. And when those two voices converge, when their harmony is recognized, the implications are unavoidable. They reveal not only the patterns of ancient expectation, but the responsibility of those who inherit understanding today. It is a quiet challenge, a soft insistence, yet one that cannot be ignored, because awareness of alignment brings clarity, and clarity demands response. This is why the scrolls were hidden. This is why the companion text remained almost invisible. And this is why, for those who listen carefully, the weight of comprehension can no longer be set aside. The mystery is not complete. It is only beginning. And those who follow its thread will find that the journey, the unfolding of prophecy, the measure of faith, the alignment of understanding, continues far beyond these pages, far beyond what has been whispered so far. To remain attentive is to enter that unfolding. To pause is to risk distance. And to follow with reverence is to encounter the sacred pattern waiting quietly for recognition. The story continues. The message persists. And those who are willing to perceive its alignment will understand that prophecy is never truly past. It is always present.